All right, when we use the term speciation, we are talking about doing what? Well, becoming a new species. So when we say speciation, becoming a new species, a new distinct species. So in this section on macroevolution, we're talking about how organisms become a new taxa or evolve into a new group or a new species over time. Okay? So in the part 1 here on macroevolution, part 2 notes, talks about allopatric speciation as a mode of speciation. And we're going to go through this one, and then there's also a sympatric mode, which I don't really know that many examples of. Your book doesn't even really give a lot of stuff here. But the allopatric's one we're probably going to focus most of the time on. Allopatric. Allo means different. Patric means place. So this is speciation occurring in different species are splitting up in different locations and becoming, or things are splitting up and then they're becoming species as they get separated. Okay? And this is normally what we think of when new species evolve, because if you're in a different place, you're probably in a different environment, and you probably would expect changes to occur over time. Part 1, Matthew, go.
In this way, a geographic barrier becomes present within the environment separating the parent population. This barrier can create 2 different environments, which could cause each species to begin to change, evolve over time, potentially lead to different species.
Okay, so speaking of geographic barrier, so there's some barrier in place or becomes in place, and it separates different groups. As groups or individuals get isolated over time, reproductively isolated, if they're reproducing over here together, they're reproducing over here together, what happens is certain traits may start to get selected for, and over time we may see changes take place. There's a good example in your 9th grade bio book of a couple squirrels on each side of the Grand Canyon. One would they look very similar. They're not like our typical gray squirrels here. They got some weird like tufts on their ears or something. I can't remember exactly, but they do look different. And one of them is black, and one of them I think is a lighter gray color. I can't remember which one's on which side of the canyon. But anyway, over time, these squirrels have been separated. The Grand Canyon's got the Colorado River flowing through it, so it's a pretty big river. It's flowing constantly. And so there's not a lot of squirrels trying to swim that joker. And so essentially what's happened is these 2 populations have been isolated, and different characteristics have been selected for. Probably the most easiest to see is the color selection there. And those isolated populations have grown apart because of that. Okay? And do what?
That's a part of it. That's catagenesis, right? Wherever like a new species.
A new clade develops, a new group. Yeah, you have new groups that develop.
Okay.
Yeah. So anagenesis would be like one evolved or changed over time as there were environmental changes. It's kind of like a change as that lineage gets passed down. I don't know that you see that a lot. I think more often you see like new environmental conditions that cause changes, or you see one individual or some individuals in a population that, I don't know, get displaced on an island or somewhere else, and then you see new changes result. I think that's probably more likely to happen. All right, so some examples of allopatric speciation are the ring species. So not Lord of the Rings, but the ring. So think of these organisms are evolving around a geographic barrier. So it could be like a mountain range. The book gives you an example of the Isthmus of Panama here, which is right here. And we've got some different species of crayfish that have evolved around this Isthmus of Panama as it's developed over time. Now, if you don't know this, most of Central America has formed fairly geologically recently from what? Volcanic eruptions. Good. And if you go there today, there's still lots of active volcanoes all throughout Central America. And so a lot of this separation has taken place. You can see these species are very similar here, but they've kind of got isolated in different sections around Panama in the ocean. And so we see some distinct speciation that takes place because of that. Another example of this ring species is, I feel like there was an AP exam question on some kind of rodents, maybe like a little rat or mole or mouse or something, that lived in different areas around the Colorado Rockies. So they had Colorado Rockies, you kind of have this large mountain range snowcap. These rodents get kind of scattered out around the Rockies, and then there's some distinct characteristics because of the isolation of these populations as they're scattered out. And so over time, as those populations are kind of isolated in their own little sections, they're just reproducing with one another. Remember, the smaller the group, the more changes take place. If you want to stay in genetic equilibrium or Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, one of the main things that you have to have is a what? A large population. Because if you don't have a large population, that's going to affect your random mating. Some traits are going to be more likely to be passed on just because of random occurrences happening where, a few individuals get lightning struck or killed by a flood or whatever. And so you don't maintain the diversity of genes in a smaller population as well.
So it's like most of extreme evolution come from bottleneck events.
Okay, so bottleneck's a type of genetic drift, right? So, and then also the founder effect. So I would say, a lot of that's going to happen when you have some event, you have some major environmental change, or something that's isolating populations. I would say probably more the founder effect than bottleneck. And then you have just a few individuals that survive and pass on their traits. We hear you, Rister. Yeah, because if you think about organisms that came from land and they somehow made their way to the Hawaiian Islands, like 25% of the species on the Hawaiian Islands are considered their own species. You couldn't take them somewhere, even if you took them somewhere, they wouldn't be expected to interbreed with wherever similar species from somewhere else, wherever they came from. So, and the Hawaiian Islands haven't been around for that long a time. And so there's been some dramatic speciation take place on the islands as stuff was brought over and made its way over in one form or another. It's really amazing to think that 2,000 or 3,000 miles out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, you have this great ball of diversity in the Hawaiian Islands just because they're not that old and it's so far away from the mainland, It's difficult for stuff to get there. I mean, you got to have a lot of birds coming through pooping seeds out to get that many plants of different varieties. All right, let's go to this next part and kind of goes along with this, the adaptive radiation. Read that one for us, Walker.
In this type of allopatric speciation, a species also migrates into new environments. As time and successive generations go by, those organisms may begin to change/evolve to meet the requirements of that new environment. Then some of the new species population moves farther out to the next island, causing the process of change/evolution to occur over time again. So ultimately what happens is that each island has its own species that evolved in response to that island's environment. They all came from the mainland parent population initially and changed/evolved as time went on by each island. So when you look at all the species in respect to the parent species, we see a couple of things. On the island that is closest to the mainland, we see the fewest changes from the parent species, because that island environment is probably very similar to the mainland environment. On the island that is farthest from the mainland, we see the most changes from the parent species, because that environment is most likely very different than the mainland environment.
Yeah, so basically the farther you get away from the mainland, the more changes you would expect. And the closer you are to the mainland, the more similarities you would expect. So, and also if you had things like birds, there's more likely if you're closer to the mainland, you're more likely to have some individuals that continually kind of come over and interbreed, like that place in the Netherlands. I remember that island we looked at where birds were still coming over and they were affecting the survival rate of the ones in the central part of the island. Yes. Okay, we got one person who remembered that. Good. So the farther you are away, the more likely those species are to be isolated from the mainland and changes to occur. All right, a good example of this one is the Galapagos finches. So we're going to talk about finches and turtles real quick here. So the Galapagos finches are really important because we have a bunch of different finches. I'm going to say there's about 13 or so. If I'm not mistaken, there's about 15 or 16 main different islands. And so you've got these finches that are on the different islands. They're all very similar type finches. that come from some species back on land, okay? Probably somewhere off the coast of like Ecuador or Peru. And so as they made their way into these different islands, the islands have very drastically different habitats. Some are very dry, some are very moist, some are very kind of in between. Some are older, and the soil is broken down more. Some are newer, volcanic. And so you have a wide range of habitats. And so the driving force behind the changes in the finches is the changes in food. So, and you can even see this till this day. Like there was an ACT passage a long time ago. They let us use it for practice. And basically they had a graph, and I think maybe it may be in your book or maybe in the 9th grade book, where it has Galapagos finches, their beak size, and then the weather, and it's graphed together. And so basically what you can tell there, I want to say it was directly after the drier years, the beak size increased. And so basically what happened those drier years, the seeds were harder and they were more difficult to crack. So you needed a bigger, stronger beak to crack those seeds. And so the resulting generations the next year or two had bigger beaks. It went up. I mean, it was slight, like a millimeter or half a millimeter or a couple millimeters, but it was enough where you could tell there was a distinct difference there. And then when you had a bunch of wet years, after that, you would see the beak size slightly decrease because you have these softer, wet seeds that were easy to crack into, so it wasn't necessary to have the bigger beaks. And so you could see these changes take place and fluctuate on a yearly basis, okay? So anyway, imagine over the course of, hundreds or thousands of generations of being isolated on these islands where you wind up with some pretty distinct differences based on whatever the food sources are. The same thing with the Galapagos tortoises. Does anybody remember from 9th grade why those tortoises, how they're different? You know what I'm talking about, the big tortoises? Size of what?
It's the type of shell. Like,
Shell has a little bit to do with it, but not as much, yeah.
How they can use their necks.
Their necks, the length of the necks. Some of them have very short necks, and some of them have like these really long necks. Now, their shell is shaped a little bit differently based on their head, so that they can,
one has like an opening sort of.
so they can reach up higher. And it's all about being able to reach food. And so the ones with the really long necks, do you think they live on a drier island or a wet island? Drier, because there's less food available on the ground. It's not as wet, and they're having to reach up and get on and access more like shrubs and stuff. And so the ones with the short necks, the islands are more moist, and they're able to have more vegetation along the ground, so that's not a necessity for them. And so these are all very closely related and came from, some common ancestor over on the mainland. Maybe there was a hurricane and a big sea mat came over. Who knows how they got over there? But some of the turtles made their way over there. They survived. There was enough food where they were able to survive and reproduce and pass on their traits. So that's a good example of adaptive radiation, where you have radiation adapt and kind of think of like magic rays of sunshine, like spreading out. You have like one main one, and then they encounter new environments, and there's a bunch of new ones develop. All right, the next section is on sympatric speciation. Think of same, think of like symbiosis, okay? So these are species that are evolving while they're in the same geographic area. And let's see, these are probably less likely. Read that part on animals for us, Katie.
For animals, this may occur because of competition for resources such as food. The dominant individuals having more favorable traits will get the resource that is being competed for. The weaker group having less favorable traits will try to find a different resource to use. This change in resource utilization may lead to change or evolution of the weaker group over time in successive generations until we get two different species within the same environment.
Yeah, so this is a lot less likely to happen, especially for animals. Your book only gives the example of if there is a reduced sexual selection or habitat differentiation that occurs. And it also says these factors can also promote allopatric speciation. So there's a little iffiness there, and I'm not going to get into that much because there's just not really good examples given. But I do want to talk about the plant part, because the plant one's one you might see show up. And for plants, this sympatric speciation, where you evolve while you're living in the same area, is primarily due to this phenomenon called polyploidy. Ploidy is a reference to what? diploid, haploid, yeah, your genetic content, how many chromosomes you have. And so in plants, a lot of times they have multiple numbers of chromosomes, which is called polyploidy, like way more than we would normally have. So normally we're diploid, and so we have 2 pairs, one from mom, one from dad. Strawberries have 8 chromosomal pairs. To get seedless watermelons, some watermelons have 2 pairs, they're diploid, and some have 4, they're tetraploid. And then you mix them together, you get a triploid offspring. And that triploid offspring is kind of like a mule. It's not really viable, and so that's why they don't produce seeds, and then that's how you get your seedless watermelons. You're welcome. So, let's look at some examples of this. Autopolyploidy, auto means self. So this is where you get polyploidy, these excessive numbers of chromosomes due to self-pollination. Some plants can self-pollinate. And then allopolyploidy is where you have plants that are crossing. And so for some reason, there's different numbers show up because of that crossing, kind of like I talked with the seedless watermelons. Although it's not a great example because they wind up being, they don't produce seeds, they're infertile. Anyway, so plants, they can oftentimes survive and do well with this different chromosomal numbers. And sometimes these excessive chromosomal numbers gives them different traits or different characteristics. And over time, that can lead to new species if they're isolating their reproduction from other polyploids. Okay? I'll give you a few examples in the book, but that's, I think, about all you need to know there. All right, let's skip on down to the next part on punctuated equilibrium. And let's turn to page 514 in your book. 514? No. Is that too far? No, 514. Yes, that is where I want to be. All right. Punctuated equilibrium. Equilibrium means what?
Balance.
Who? Yeah, balance. It's staying the same, right? And then punctuated means stops, right? So punctuated equilibrium means you have some changes that occur because just imagine you have an environment that's staying the same, it's in equilibrium, and then all of a sudden there's some catastrophic change, something happens, and it ends. That's your punctuated part. And after that point, you wind up with new environments. And because you have new environments, then new species are going to evolve or change. And so we're going to go through geologic time here and kind of hit some of the high points. So, and you can see an example on 514. I don't really think they did a good job of drawing this, where you have, you know, a species that stays the same, and then all of a sudden you see in the fossil record, you see a lot of new species form and show up. Whereas the other mode, the gradual mode, you can see this butterfly. They get some butterflies here just for a color, I think, sake. And in the gradual mode, this butterfly gradually evolves into a couple of different ones over time. But it's a slow, gradual process. That's more like that, almost like the anagenesis, right? That we talked about, except it's going in 2 different directions there. All right. Because it's small-scale gradual changes, it would still be technically cladogenesis, but it's small changes. All right, punctuated equilibrium. Number 2, let's talk about dinosaurs. Okay, I'm going to give you the high points here so we don't have to read through all this. But basically, a long time ago, there were a bunch of dinosaurs, and it was called Jurassic Park. No. Actually, let's tell you what. Let's be serious here. Come on, you guys. Geologic time. Where's my picture of geologic time? 527. So I'll give you this picture here. Look at this. So here's the picture of geologic time. And you can see some dinosaurs running around there. It looks kind of like a velociraptor or T-Rex. Okay. So up until about 65 million years ago, there were a bunch of dinosaurs running around the Mesozoic era. And all of a sudden, in the fossil record, dinosaurs ceased to exist. And so what do scientists think was the primary cause of that? Asteroid. So a large asteroid hits the Earth, shoots water out, shoots dust and ash out. There's tsunamis and tidal waves everywhere. The temperature on Earth probably dramatically increases. I listened to an interesting hypothesis on Radio Lab, which is a podcast I listen to a lot, and they have a lot of science stuff on there. And they talked about they had some scientists on there, a climate scientist, talking about the probability that there was a dramatic change in the temperature on Earth that would like be enough to almost kill everything. Not much stuff surviving that was like at the surface. Do what?
Like now? Or?
No. When the asteroid hit. And they talked about the asteroid coming through the atmosphere and it hitting the Earth and creating all this heat. Anyway, and they had some evidence based on some kind of little crystals that were found in that layer, but I don't. You'll have to look that up on your own. Anyway, that's not important. So, what evidence do we have that a meteor hit the Earth?
Like the population of dinosaurs.
Well, I mean, one, they went extinct, right? If you go off the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula, there is a very large crater. It's like 100, I want to say it's 100 kilometers wide. It's huge. So Yucatan, think of like Cancun, all you guys out there partying in Cancun right now. So if you go off the northern coast of that, there in the ocean, there is a gigantic crater. It's like I said, it's huge. And so that's where scientists think that a meteor hit the Earth 65 million years ago. Just imagine, boom, dust and ash goes in the air. You have tsunamis and tidal waves going out everywhere. And actually in Alabama, where we live, about an hour south of here between Demopolis and Livingston, if you ever go out on the, is that the Tom Bigby down there or the Alabama? I can't remember what river it is at that point. I think it's Tom Bigby. And once you go down that part of the river, there's a section along the bank where you can see what's called the KT boundary. The KT boundary is the boundary between the Cretaceous and the Cenozoic, the Cretaceous period and the Cenozoic era, so that where the dinosaurs died out there. But it's not like a flat straight line. It's actually kind of like some rippled hills and humps. I've seen some drawings of it. It's not a line. Why do you think it's not a line there? Where you could see like, here's a line. We have, one easy way to tell that a meteor hit the Earth was when the dinosaurs. So you have a bunch of dinosaurs, no dinosaurs above that, and then also on this line you also have a lot of. There's some kind of element that's found in meteors that's usually not found on Earth. And so when it hits here and all this dust and ash comes and settles back down, then it settles in that layer. And so there's a bunch of that meteoric element in that layer. I can't remember what it's called. What was I going for? Oh, why is it not straight across, you think? Because we don't live that far from Mexico. And so the idea is that there was probably such a massive tidal wave that came in, tsunami, that it was bringing in like a huge waves of dirt and material over land as that water flowed inland. And deposited a lot of that, and it wasn't in a nice, neat little barrier. It was kind of like in little waves and humps. And so that tsunami is thought to have moved all the way up into like, so imagine the central portion of the U.S. where like Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, all those places are. That was all like an inland waterway. So if you go out to Wyoming now, we went out there a few years ago, and you can go like fossil hunting on some of these like higher butte areas, and it's just covered in fish and marine fossils. And so that area used to be like low-lying, covered in ocean. And so there's still some evidence there of the KT boundary where that tsunami came in and killed a bunch of stuff. Anyhow, so we have evidence for this. You have a bunch of animals and plants, and they all are about the same. And then all of a sudden, boom, there are no more of them. We see a bunch of new stuff. Now, some things had to survive, obviously, or we wouldn't be having other things around. So an interesting thing to note here on 527, I'm going to go through some of these main geologic periods, and this is in the notes. Number 3 in the notes talks about snowball Earth and how it was really cold a long time ago before the Cambrian period. And so there are basically 3 main eras in geologic time. So we have the Paleozoic era here, and I'm going to start there because the Paleozoic era starts with the Cambrian period. Now, there is almost a creationist-like event that's discussed in science called the Cambrian explosion. So basically, you don't have hardly anything in the fossil record, and then all of a sudden, in this Cambrian time period, there's like an explosion of life, marine animals and fossils all over the place. It's crazy. Like tons and tons of stuff, and they were never found before that. And so, like I said, scientists call it the Cambrian explosion. So your note writer here says the suspected hypothesis is that the Earth was very cold. It warmed up. The only thing that was surviving at that time period was probably like stuff living in deep sea vents. It warmed up. Things were able to move into new environments, and then just an explosion of life took place in the oceans. Over time, you see this kind of explosion of life, and then reptiles and fishes and stuff. Fishes and reptiles start to appear. We have different plants that start to grow on land, and then you move into the Mesozoic era. Now, in the Mesozoic era, which is this peachy one up here at the top, this is what we think of as the age of the dinosaurs. Okay, we have the Triassic, Jurassic, which you're all familiar with from Jurassic Park. And then actually most of the animals that you see in Jurassic Park that are actually real and not some weird hybrid that they created for TV were actually found in the Cretaceous period, the last 80 million years or so of the Mesozoic era. And so two main things. The Mesozoic era was dominated by reptiles, and it was also dominated primarily by gymnosperms, things like cone-bearing plants. There were a few rodents in the fossil record, or rodent-like animals, and there were a few flowering plants that started to show up, but not many. And so when the age of the dinosaurs ended, you have this meteor hit the Earth. Really, the Cenozoic era, which we're in now, has been dominated by what type of plants? What type of plants like dominate the Earth? Angiosperms, flowering plants. Like 80% of species on Earth now are angiosperms. And what type of animals dominate the Earth now? Mammals. So mammals dominate. Most of the larger and reptilian stuff was killed out, except our friendly crocodiles and some of the other stuff may have developed into birds. So we have some dramatic changes that take place. Anyhow, any questions on that one? Oh, Pangea. Now, I know y'all have heard of Pangea. I'll try to find a video on this. Pangea was around a long, long time before the age of the extinction of the dinosaurs. And basically, the idea is that the Earth's been moving around a lot, and the Earth's still moving around a lot. Like, we're still getting farther and farther away from where? Europe. And we're getting closer to Asia. About every year, we move about an inch or two that way. What evidence do we have that North and South America were once next to Europe and Africa? Fossil species, rocks that were similar, and the most children answer is, yeah, it looks like they go together. It looks like a couple puzzle pieces. And we know in between Europe and Africa and North and South America, there's this thing called the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, and that Mid-Atlantic Ridge is constantly spreading apart. And so if you go down there and like look where this is occurring, you can see that the plates are pulling apart, new lava's coming up, it forms these little ridges, and more plates pull apart, or the plates are pulling apart, and more lava comes up and forms little ridges, and we know we're getting farther apart. And then we know over by Asia, plates are sinking, the Pacific plate sinking under the Eurasian plate, so we're getting farther that way. So anyway, that's evidence for this Pangea event that we talk about, okay? All right, let's finish up here. On the last section, we know Darwin didn't really mention the term evolution a lot. I think one time in the book, On Origin of the Species. But he did mention descent with modification quite a bit. And so the note writer here goes through and talks about descent with modification quite a bit. And kind of gives you some examples as you look throughout the lineage of different animals, how the structure of the eye has changed over time. And so let's go through. We'll just take turns reading this because it's very, very lengthy. And we'll talk about how what we know is the eye, and we see it's very different in different things. So one of our most important sense, it has changed significantly as animals have become more and more developed. So let's go, Miranda. Part A, start us off.
The eye starts out as a collection of light-sensing pigments called osteocyli, located on the external surface of the veil of jellyfish. This allows them to tell basic direction up towards the sun and down into the dark bottom. They can also see shadows, either predators or food moving. You can do the same with your eyes closed. The problem is the cells are not on the surface where they can be damaged with a brush against a rock or other rough surface.
All right. 5, continue.
Nature tried to solve this problem over time by recessing the cells into a sunken recess, such as we see in the eye spots of these flatworms.
Yeah, so if y'all don't know, there's 3 different types of worm. Platyhelminthes are the most primitive, simplest worms. They don't have any kind of segmentation or anything like that. So they have a very, very simple eye. Go.
This protected the light-sensing cells, but created a new problem: sediment collection in the recess. Nature tried to solve this problem over time by sinking the cells down farther and reducing the opening to recess, such as we see in some annelids and mollusks.
Okay, annelids are your earthworms and leeches and some mollusks. I think they're talking about probably like snails.
Problem solved regarding the sediment in the recess, but new problem created: lack of light in the recess, causing decreased vision and light detection.
All right, hold on. Mason, go from there.
Nature tried to solve this problem over time by putting a layer of transparent cells over the opening. This would act as a simple magnifying glass to increase the amount of light entering the eye. Problem solved, but new problem created. The vision is not clear because of the layer of cells the light passes through. Nature tried to solve this problem over time by forming a lens using a clear protein called crystalline. This would enhance and clarify any image. This is seen in arthropods.
Okay, so arthropods with this lens, these are our like insect friends, okay? Insects, spiders, that whole group.
By this time, these animals were able to move quickly within their environments. So, new problem: no depth perception. All vision is basically 2D. Nature tried to solve this problem over time by attaching muscles to the lens to stretch it where it's needed. This manipulation of the lens allowed for the ability to detect differences in depth and thus more 3D to a degree. This is seen in all higher organisms such as cephalopods, fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. Problem solved. It works well, and that is why we see it unchanged essentially in the higher organisms.
All right, and so they basically, if you think about anything, any kind of vertebrate, fish, salamanders, mammals, birds, reptiles, and they also include a invertebrate group, cephalopods. Specifically, they're talking about like squid and octopi because they have an eye that's very similar to us. If you've ever seen like a giant squid eye, it's like the size of a basketball, but functions basically similar to us. So they've kind of evolved within this group. Anyhow, and so we have an eye that's able to see in 3D. We have a lens inside our eye. You can take a lens out of any kind of fish or any kind of small vertebrate like that, and there's a little lens just like ours, and it's able to manipulate and change depth perception. So there's a dramatic change in the function of how the eye works and is able to see stuff over time. All right, guys, we finish the notes tomorrow.